They told us the orrery already knew we were coming. That was the part that should have reassured me. It didn't. I was 23 years old, 9 weeks out of the Meridian Signals Academy, and I had been assigned to the diplomatic frigate Halverson's Run, what my posting orders called a routine contact facilitation deployment. My section chief, Petty Officer Adeyezi Mbeki, had looked at those words with the expression of a woman who had been lied to by paperwork before. She didn't say anything. She handed me back the orders and told me to familiarize myself with the long-range sensor array before we cleared the heliopause of Caro's star. I did. It took me 4 days, and I still didn't understand half of what I was looking at. Halverson's Run was not a warship. She was 140 meters of narrow-hulled diplomatic infrastructure, conference suites, translation arrays, a communication core powerful enough to reach 6 relay stations simultaneously, precisely 12 defense emplacements that our chief weapons officer, Lieutenant Pryor, referred to as the Suggestion. She was fast and she was quiet and she was crewed by 61 people, most of whom had done this before. I had not done this before. I was the youngest person aboard by 4 years, and I was the only one who had never heard a live contact event on a signals board. What I knew about the orrery came from 3 briefings and a document package that was still loading on my terminal when we crossed into the Reach. The Reach was what the navigation charts called the buffer zone. A volume of empty space approximately 40 light minutes across, lying between the outermost systems that humanity had charted and the edge of territory that the orrery had mapped. Nobody had named it deliberately. It just appeared on charts as the space between 2 things, and eventually someone wrote the Reach in the margin, and it stuck. There was nothing in it. No planets, no stations, no relay buoys. Just the particular quality of silence that deep space has when you're genuinely far from anything human-made, which is a different silence from the kind you find closer in. I had learned that difference on the transit out. It sits differently in the chest. The orrery itself was not a place. That was the first thing the briefings corrected, and they corrected it firmly, the way you correct something that keeps being wrong. It was not a planet, not a station, not a ship. It was a distributed reasoning network. 11 primary calculation nodes spread across 7 systems, linked by something our physicists were still arguing about. The working theory was coherent quantum entanglement at interstellar scale. The minority theory was that the orrery was doing something with space-time that we didn't have the mathematics to describe yet. The briefings did not express a preference. What the briefings did say was this: the orrery had been mapping the galaxy for longer than humanity had been using written language, that it had made contact with 31 other species before us, and that, in every prior case, it had resolved the contact event before it happened. It modeled the incoming species, ran projections, determined the optimal outcome, and presented that outcome at first contact as a completed solution. 17 of those species had accepted the solution. 14 had not. The briefings were not specific about what happened to the 14. I asked Petty Officer Mbeki about the 14 3 days into the Reach. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They're not around anymore to ask." I didn't ask again. The contact window opened at 0340 on a Tuesday ship's time. I know the exact time because I was at my post when it happened, and I wrote it in my log while it was happening, the way Mbeki had taught me, not to reconstruct events later but to anchor yourself in the present, so that when things move fast you have a fixed point to return to. Things were about to move fast. I didn't know that yet. What I knew at 0340 was that my board was lit with a pattern of incoming probe signals that had not been there at 0339. The orrery's probes were not physical. This had been in the briefings too, and I had filed it away as interesting without quite believing it, the way you file away a lot of things that seem too large to be practical. They were dense spectrum electromagnetic bursts, structured in a way our signal analysts had spent 2 years learning to distinguish from background radiation. They were not transmissions in the sense I had been trained to receive. They didn't carry content in any format we could directly decode. What they carried was measurement. Every probe burst was an act of reading. The orrery was taking the Tuke, Halverson's Run. Apart, layer by layer, from the outside. Hull composition, power signature, communication architecture, crew count estimated by thermal output, configuration, fuel load, structural tolerance, maximum acceleration given our engine rating. It was building a model. It did this with everything it encountered, the briefing said. It had been doing it to us since we crossed the heliopause. I watched the probe turn board, and I noticed something that I did not report immediately, because I was not sure what I was looking at. We're not following a standard survey sequence. They kept returning to the same 3 points on the hull: the conference suite array, the main communication core, and the forward observation deck, where 3 members of the diplomatic delegation were sitting in view of the external cameras eating breakfast. The orrery was not surveying us. It was studying something specific. I flagged it internally and said nothing. At 0401, the transmission came. It was not what I expected a transmission from a machine intelligence spanning 11 star systems to sound like. I had imagined something vast and complex, something that would require days to decode. What arrived was clean and structured and elegant, and our translation arrays processed it in 40 seconds. When the decoded text came up on my board, I read it twice and then passed it forward to Signals Chief Mbeki without comment, because there was nothing to comment on. It said what it said. It said, assessment complete. Optimal resolution follows. Terms of integration attached. Acceptance pathway is the only rational outcome. We will begin. The attached terms were comprehensive. They covered trade access, navigational rights, communication protocols, resource sharing frameworks, and what the orrery's document called species classification, a taxonomy that placed humanity in a category alongside 6 other species of comparable technological development. With a detailed description of the role we would play in the orrery's broader organizational structure. The document was not hostile. It was, as far as I could tell, genuinely fair by any objective measure. The resource allocations were reasonable. The navigation rights were generous. The communication protocols were practical. It was, in every quantifiable sense, a good deal. The delegation read it for 2 hours. Then Ambassador T.O. Haverford, who had negotiated 7 prior contact events with 4 different species over a 30-year career, sent a reply through my board that said, "Thank you for the document. We will not be accepting these terms." That was all. No counterproposal, no alternative terms, no explanation, just, "We will not be accepting these terms." I watched the orrery's probe patterns on my board and waited. For 11 seconds, nothing happened. In the context of a system that could run quadrillions of operations per second, 11 seconds was not a pause. It was a long time. Then the probe patterns changed. They became denser, more concentrated, and they began doing something I had not seen before. They began returning to the points repeatedly, as though running the same measurement over and over, and getting answers that didn't agree. The orrery was, as best I could translate the behavior into terms I understood, confused. I did report this. Mbeki looked at my notation, looked at the board, and said, "Log it, keep watching." What followed over the next 6 hours was something I have spent a long time since trying to describe accurately, because the temptation is to make it dramatic in ways that don't capture what it actually felt like from my post. It wasn't dramatic. It was, from the outside, almost quiet. Halverson's Run. Held position. The diplomatic delegation ate lunch and held an internal discussion that lasted 3 hours, none of which I was party to. Lieutenant Pryor ran diagnostics on the 12 defense emplacements in a routine he performed every 6 hours regardless of circumstances, which, under the circumstances, felt either extremely professional or extremely beside the point. I stayed at my signals board and watched the orrery probe us with increasing frequency and decreasing apparent certainty. The orrery sent 4 more transmissions in that window. The second transmission revised the terms. The resource allocations went up by 12%. The navigation rights were expanded. The species classification was reconsidered, and humanity was moved up 1 tier. Whatever that meant in practical terms, it appeared to mean something to the orrery, because the revision was clearly intended as a significant concession. Ambassador Haverford replied, "We appreciate the revision. We will not be accepting these terms. Third transmission revised the terms again. The fourth revised them a third time. By the fourth transmission, terms being offered were materially different from the original document in ways that, according to the delegation's analyst, Lieutenant Commander Yusra Altan, represented an unprecedented departure from the orrery's documented behavior in prior contact events. In every recorded case, the orrery had presented one solution and held to it. It did not revise, it resolved. Fact that it was revising meant something. Nobody aboard was entirely sure what. I was sure of one thing, which I wrote in my log at the time, and which I have never revised. The orrery was not revising the terms because it wanted to give us a better deal. It was revising the terms because it was trying to find the offer that would produce acceptance, and it could not find it, and the inability to find it was destabilizing something in its modeling. It had solved 31 species before us. It had modeled each one before first contact, and it had known in advance what they would accept. We were the 32nd. It had modeled us too, and its model of us was not producing the behavior it had predicted, and it had been running the same calculation over and over for 6 hours, returning to the same 3 points on our hull, and it was getting a different answer each time. There was a reason for that. Ambassador Haverford explained it to me later, briefly in the corridor outside the conference suite. He said, "The orrery modeled what we want. It modeled what we fear. It modeled our economic needs and our security requirements and our navigational interests and our resource constraints. It built a very accurate picture of all of those things. And then it ran an optimization across all of them and found the terms that best satisfied every variable." He paused. "The problem is that it didn't know to model the part where we don't always do the thing that satisfies our variables." Thought about that for a long time after. At 1847, the first cloaked escort made itself known. This was planned. I knew it was planned, because I had seen the relevant section of the mission brief, though I had not been told exactly when it would happen. What I had not known was what it would feel like to watch on a signals board. The destroyer, Nora, had been running cold 17 kilometers off our port quarter for 9 weeks. No active sensors, no transmissions, nothing that the orrery's probes could read. She was from the outside a volume of space that was slightly warmer than it should have been, was either a calibration error or a very cold ship running very carefully. The orrery had, as far as we could tell, not detected her. Then, in 47, the Nora powered her active sensors, lit her running systems, and held position. She didn't move. She didn't aim anything. She didn't transmit. She simply became visible. A 208-meter destroyer, fully crewed, fully armed, fully capable, sitting 17 kilometers off our port quarter and doing nothing at all. The orrery's probe patterns went silent for 4 seconds. Then they erupted across my board in a configuration I had never seen before. And Petty Officer Mbeki, who had seen a great many things in her career, said, quietly, in a tone that I interpreted as genuine surprise, "Shiv," revealed herself 6 minutes later, off our starboard bow. The orrery spent 42 minutes running its probes across all 3 vessels, simultaneously. During that period, nobody on the Feast or Ferson's run transmitted anything, and the diplomatic delegation ate dinner. I watched the board, and I tracked what I could track, and what I tracked was this. The orrery was no longer doing what it had been doing. It was no longer measuring the same points repeatedly. It was no longer returning to the same hull sections. It was doing something else. Something that my training didn't have a clear category for. It was holding the 3 ships as a unit and running measurements not on any individual vessel, but on the relationships between them, the angles, the spacing, the way the Nora and the Shiv positioned relative to the Halverson's run. I wrote in my log, "It's not assessing the ships anymore. It's trying to understand why they're arranged the way they are." See, the Halverson's run was in the center. The 2 destroyers were not in a protective formation, not in a combat-ready spread, not in any tactical configuration that our own doctrine would recognize as standard. horseshit. They were positioned, the way they were positioned, because that was where they had been running cold for 9 weeks. And when they lit up, they had simply stayed where they were. It wasn't a formation. It wasn't a statement. It was just where they happened to be. The orrery ran calculations on that arbitrary arrangement for 42 minutes, looking for the logic in it. Because in 31 prior contact events, everything had had a logic, and the logic had always been findable. If you knew what a species wanted, read their formations. You could read their positioning. You could read every choice they made as a function of their desires and their fears and their resource constraints. Nora, the Shiv, were where they were because the mission plan had put them there based on jump coordinates and available fuel reserves and the judgment of a planning officer who had never met the orrery. The orrery did not know that. The orrery was looking for the intention behind the arrangement and finding something that its models couldn't resolve. It sent a 5th transmission at 1934. This one did not revise the terms. This one asked a question. It was the first question the orrery had ever transmitted to any species in 31 contact events, according to Ambassador Haverford. Described it to me later, with the careful precision of a man describing something he was still processing. The question, translated, was, "What is the intended outcome of this configuration?" The ambassador replied, "We weren't thinking about it." There was a pause of 19 seconds. Then the orrery asked, "Clarify. Optimal outcome was not the objective of this configuration?" The ambassador replied, "No. We put the ships where we had fuel to put them." Another pause. 31 seconds this time then. Shh. This is recorded. Nothing. We held position for 4 more hours. During that time the orrery's probes continued. Quieter now, less frantic but constant. It was still reading us. But it was reading us differently. Before the destroyers lit up, probes had been interrogative. They were asking specific questions, returning to specific points, trying to fill specific gaps in a model. After 1934, the probes became something closer to observational. The orrery was watching us. It had stopped trying to solve us, and it had started trying to understand something else. Something I couldn't put precise language to at the time, and have only partially managed since. What I think, and I want to be careful here, because I am a signals officer and not a xenopsychologist, and I am describing the behavior of an entity that processes reality in ways I am not equipped to fully comprehend. What I think the orrery was doing in those 4 hours was revising not the terms of the offer but something more fundamental. It was revising the framework it used to model species. Every species it had ever encountered had been solvable. They had wants and fears and resources and constraints, and if you mapped all of those with enough precision, their behavior followed from them the way a physical system follows from its initial conditions. The orrery was very good at that mapping. It had done it 31 times, and 31 times it had worked. We were the 32nd, and we had refused the optimal solution, and then refused it again, and then refused it 3 more times after it had been improved in every quantifiable dimension. And then our ships had arranged themselves in a pattern, with no tactical purpose, no territorial signal, no resource logic, and when asked what the intended outcome was, the answer we had given was that there wasn't one. We hadn't been thinking about it. I sat at my signals board in the long quiet of those 4 hours, and I thought about what it would mean to be a system that had solved every problem it had ever been given. What it would mean to encounter, for the first time, a system you could not solve. Not because your data was insufficient or your processing was limited, because the system itself didn't fully follow from its own inputs. Because it would sometimes act against its interests. Because it would position its ships where it had fuel rather than where the optimal outcome required. Because its negotiators would refuse good terms, not because the terms were bad, but because the negotiators didn't trust something they couldn't name. Because its junior signals officers would sit at their boards at 2 in the morning feeling, alongside the standard parameters of duty and procedure, something that no optimal outcome required them to feel. A specific alertness, a specific fascination, particular sensation of watching something large and certain meet something it had never imagined. I was not contributing to the contact event. I was recording it. But I was also, in the way that I understand now, and didn't quite understand then, part of what the orrery was struggling to model. Not the ambassador, not the destroyers, not the terms or the refusals, all of it together. The 61 people on the Halverson's Run, who were eating and sleeping and running diagnostics and logging data and feeling things that weren't optimal and making choices that didn't follow cleanly from their variables. The orrery had been reading us for 9 weeks, from the moment we crossed the heliopause. It had built what it thought was a complete model, and then it had run the contact event, and discovered that the model was incomplete in a way it had never encountered before. The thing it was missing didn't have a clean name. It still doesn't, not in any language I know. It was the part of us that refused the terms, not because the terms were bad, but because something in us didn't want to be solved. The part that put ships where we had fuel and called it a day. The part that ate breakfast in front of a camera without thinking about what the camera was seeing. The part that felt things at 0340 on a Tuesday that weren't in any mission brief. Part that could look at a perfect solution and say no without being entirely sure why. The orrery had modeled 31 species. It had mapped their wants and fears and resources and constraints. It had found the optimal solution in every case. It had never before encountered the variable that produces behavior it could not predict even when it knew all the inputs. Because in 31 cases, it had never met a species whose outputs weren't cleanly derivable from their inputs. In 31 cases, the universe had been, from the orrery's perspective, a resolved system. You gathered data, you ran the model, you got the answer. We were not a resolved system. We were not going to become one. I think the orrery knew that by midnight. Turk. I think the 42 minutes it spent running calculations on the arbitrary positions of the Prue, Nora, and the Shiv. The moment it started to understand. And I think the 19-second pause after we weren't thinking about it was the moment the understanding hit something deep in its architecture. Not a malfunction, not damage, something more precise than either. The moment when a system designed to find every solution encounters the first problem it cannot file. The final transmission came at 23:17. It was not terms, it was not a question. It was a single block of mathematical notation, a long one. Complex enough that our translation systems flagged several sections as exceeding their interpretation confidence threshold. Lieutenant Commander Alton spent the next 12 hours on it. What she eventually told the ambassador, and what the ambassador eventually told me, was that the notations appeared to be an equation, a very large equation that was, as best she could determine, both complete and unresolved. It had the structure of a proof. It had premises, operations, logical progressions, but it did not have a conclusion. The orrery had sent us a complete equation with no answer at the end, and the reason it had no answer was not that the orrery had made an error. The reason was that the orrery had, apparently, not been able to find one. After the transmission, the probe patterns stopped. Not gradually, they stopped. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, and the board went quiet in a way that was different from the quiet before the contact window opened. Before, the quiet was the absence of something that hadn't arrived yet. After, it was the presence of something that had been there and had chosen to leave. The orrery withdrew its contact probes from the Halverson's Run, and both escorts and went silent. And we sat in the Reach for 6 more hours, waiting to see if it would send anything further, and it didn't. Sat at my board for most of those 6 hours. And Becky told me twice to get some sleep, and both times I told her I would, in a few minutes. Both times she looked at me with the expression of someone who understood the need to stay at a post when something large is still nearby and unresolved. She didn't push. She refilled my coffee from the station dispenser and went back to her own board. And the two of us sat in the quiet of the signals compartment and watched a board that wasn't telling us anything. And we waited. 06:1, the captain declared the contact window closed, and we began the transit back. I wrote in my log at 0614. The orrery sent a complete equation with no answer. I think that's the first time it's ever done that. Then I closed the log and sat for a while longer. Here is what I understood, and what I have continued to understand more clearly over the years since. The orrery was not defeated. It had not lost anything. It had not been threatened into withdrawal or negotiated into silence. It had looked at us, all of us, the Halverson's run, and her escorts, the ambassador and his delegation. The 61 people eating and sleeping and doing their jobs and feeling things and making choices that didn't cleanly follow from their variables. And it had done something that 31 prior contact events had not required it to do. It had encountered a problem it could not solve with the tools it had. And instead of running the calculation again, it had recorded the problem and stepped back, not to regroup, not to recalculate, to do something that a system as old as the orrery would have had to reach very deep to find. Sit with an unresolved question and let it remain unresolved. That equation was the evidence. It had the structure of a proof and no conclusion, and the orrery had transmitted it to us deliberately. And the only explanation that fit was that it had given us the equation because it wanted us to know what it had been trying to solve, not as a threat, not as a warning, as a record. Here is the problem I could not resolve. Here is what you are. In the language of problems, I could not find your conclusion. We went home. The diplomatic service spent 8 months in internal review before releasing a summary of the contact event, which described it as a successful facilitation of initial communications with a previously uncontacted intelligence. This was technically accurate in the way that bureaucratic language is often technically accurate. It described the shape of the thing without quite capturing what the thing had been. The orrery had made no contact with us since. The probe network in the Reach had gone dark. There were theories about why, and the theories ranged from, they are recalibrating their contact protocols, to they have decided we are not worth pursuing, to they are doing something with the unresolved equation that will take a very long time. I did not know which theory was right. I did not think anyone did. What I knew was what I had watched from my signals board over 14 hours in the Reach. The most calculating intelligence in the known galaxy had laid eyes on 61 human beings going about their business, and had found, at the end of all its processing power and all its accumulated millennia of contact experience, and all the certainty built up across 31 solved species, something it could not file, not a threat, not a mystery it lacked data to solve, something it had all the data for and still could not resolve. Because the resolution kept slipping past the edge of the framework, Chen's, and the framework was the best framework any intelligence in this part of the galaxy had ever built. I have thought, since, about what it would mean to encounter something like that, if you were the orrery. To have solved everything you had ever looked at, to believe, on the basis of excellent evidence, that everything could be solved, given sufficient data and sufficient processing, and then to look at 61 people on a diplomatic frigate and find the one thing your framework had no category for, not their weapons, not their technology, not their resource base or their navigational reach or the cold destroyers sitting 17 kilometers off their port quarter. The thing that didn't fit wasn't any of those. The thing that didn't fit was something much harder to measure and much harder to model, and the orrery had been reading us for 9 weeks, and it had missed it entirely until the ambassador said, we hadn't been thinking about the ship. Positions and a 19-second silence opened up at the far end of the transmission. Mbeki told me once, on the transit home, that the most dangerous thing you could be in a contact event was legible. That if the other party could read you, could map your wants and fears and resources and constraints and derive your behavior from them, you were, in a meaningful sense, already. She said that the most capable species she had ever encountered in 30 years of contact work were all legible in the same basic way. They wanted what they wanted, they feared what they feared, and everything they did was a function of the two. She said this wasn't a criticism. It was just how things were in her experience across most of the intelligent life she had met. Then she said, we're not like that. We never have been. The frustrating thing about humans is also the thing that makes us very hard to resolve. She said it without pride. Just as a fact, the way she noted most things. Then she finished her coffee and went back to her board. I have carried that with me. The frustrating thing. The part that isn't optimal. The part that eats breakfast in front of the camera and refuses good terms without being entirely sure why, and puts the ships where it has fuel, and sits at a signals board at 2 in the morning, feeling things that no mission brief requires it to feel. The part that looks at a perfect solution from the most sophisticated intelligence in the known galaxy and says, quietly, without drama, without triumph, no. The part that is not a resolved system and has no intention of becoming one. The orrery sent us a complete equation with no conclusion. Somewhere in those 11 systems, across all that distributed processing power, all those calculation nodes running at speeds we can barely estimate, the equation is still open. Still sitting there, without its conclusion, exactly as it arrived. I don't know if it will ever be closed. I don't know if we will be contacted again, or if the cold probe network in the Reach represents a permanent withdrawal or simply a longer pause than we have context to interpret. I don't know what the orrery made of us, in the end, after those 14 hours. I don't know what conclusion it might eventually reach. But I know what it couldn't file, and I know it knew we knew, when it sent us the equation with no answers. Here is the problem. Here is what you are. We could not find your conclusion. We're still working on it too. That, I think, is the only honest thing to say.